Hello, in this video I will give you an overview of AWS IAM. You will learn the basic of authentication and authorization, what IAM is, the features and terminologies of IAM, and how AWS IAM works. Authentication and authorization. Authentication. AWS IAM is the service used to manage authentication and authorization in AWS accounts. Authentication is the process in which an individual or an entity tries to access a system or an account by providing a valid credential. Authentication technology provides access control for systems by checking to see if a user's credential matches the credential in a database of authorized users. AWS IAM enables you to keep your AWS account secure by permitting only authenticated users or applications to log in into your AWS cloud environment. In AWS accounts, individuals like software developers can authenticate to gain access to resources. Also, entities or non-human things like running scripts or applications can provide credentials for authentication to gain access to protected resources. Now let's look at authorization. Authorization is the process of giving someone or an entity the permission to access a resource. Authentication and authorization are two different things. Authentication grants access to the account, while authorization gives the permission to perform actions in the account. So after a user authenticates by presenting his or her credentials, it does not automatically give the users permission to perform any action within the AWS account. IAM policies are used to grant or deny permissions to perform certain actions in AWS accounts. When a IAM principal is created, you assign a policy to the principal. This policy is used to determine what actions the principal can perform in your AWS account. By default, all requests are denied in AWS accounts except there is an explicit allow in a policy attached to a principal. So in your AWS account, every permissions, every actions are denied. They are denied by default unless you create a policy and attach it to the principal that explicitly allow the action. So then what is AWS IAM? AWS Identity and Access Management is a web service that helps you securely control access to your AWS resources. With IAM, you can centrally manage permissions that control which AWS resources users can access. You use AWS IAM to control who is authenticated, that means signed in, and who is authorized, that means who has permissions to perform actions on a resource or use a resource. IAM features. Identity Federation. This is one of the features of AWS IAM. And identity federation is the process in which you can use existing credentials of a user to allow them to be able to log in into the AWS account. So let's say your organization already use Azure AD, for example. The users can continue to use the credentials that is already created in Azure AD while they are able to then access AWS resources. Shared access to your AWS account. You can share access to other users. Let's say you have developers, you have QA team, you have security compliance engineers, and you want to give them access to your AWS account. You can create IAM users for each of them and then grant them access. So you can share access to other users to be able to access your AWS account. Now again, it allows you to grant granular permissions, and granular permissions just means that you can specifically grant access to certain resources or deny access to certain resources. And again, it grants secure access to AWS resources for applications that run on Amazon EC2 instance. Now, EC2 is just a compute service that AWS provides. It's like a remote server that AWS manage, and you can securely grant access to applications that are running in EC2 instance to be able to access other resources in your AWS account. Now, multi-factor authentication is also available in AWS IAM. So when you create an IAM user, you can enable multi-factor authentication. Identity information for assurance, PCI DSS compliance. Now, AWS IAM is compliance to PCI DSS. AWS IAM integrates with many AWS services. I can't really think right now of any services that don't need AWS IAM, but it definitely integrates with many AWS services. And guess what? AWS IAM is free to use, so there's no cost using AWS IAM. And it is eventually consistent, and this means that the changes you make will have to be reflected all across regions and also all across the AZs. So if you make a change in a specific region, it will eventually reflect all across the regions, that means globally. Accessing IAM, if you want to access IAM, there are various ways in which you can access this service. And that means if you want to start doing configurations with it, if you want to set up permissions, if you want to set up users, if you want to set up roles, there are various ways you can be able to access this service. And one of the ways is AWS Management Console. The second way is through the AWS Command Line tool. The Command Line tool is a tool that's provided by AWS that you can be able to use to run command through your command line in your machine. The AWS SDK, so developers can use the AWS SDKs to be able to access IAM functionalities and call IAM APIs. IAM query APIs, again, this is another way that you can be able to configure IAM in your AWS account. You can access IAM functionalities, IAM features through these four mechanisms. It is important for us to understand some basic terminologies relating to IAM, and one of them is IAM users. An IAM user is basically a representative of an individual in your organization. Let's say you have a developer and you want the developer to be able to access your AWS account in order for them to be able to deploy applications to EC2 instances, or even use Lambda, or even use S3, or use RDS. You can go into AWS IAM either through the console or through the CLI and create an IAM user and call that user developer, and then grant that user the permissions to be able to perform those actions. So basically, an IAM user represents an individual in your organization. Now, just to also add to that, an IAM user can also be used to also represent an application. So if you don't want to have a user accessing the console, you can disable console access and grant just programmatic access. That means the credentials from the IAM user can be used in a script that is running in any server that you deploy. IAM group. An IAM group is a mechanism that is available for you to be able to grant permissions to a group that has similar functions. So if you have a group of developers, like 5 developers in your organization across different regions, instead of creating each individual users and then attaching specific permissions to those users, you can create a group, then create those users and put all of those users into the group and then attach permission to that group. Now, what's the advantage of doing this? This allows you to be able to centrally manage the policies, the permissions that are granted to those users. An IAM role is an identity within your AWS account that has specific permissions. It is similar to an IAM user, but it is not associated with a specific person. It is a way to grant temporary credentials to entities by assuming the role. You can assume a role by calling an AWS CLI or AWS API operation, or by using a custom URL. Request. When a principal tries to use the AWS Management Console, the AWS API, or the AWS CLI, the principal sends a request to AWS. The request usually includes actions and resources. Actions or operations are the actions or operations that the principal wants to perform, while resources are the AWS resource objects upon which the actions or the operations are performed. IAM policies. IAM policies are just the mechanism used to grant permissions to be able to perform those actions. So you see that a policy will grant permission to a specific identity, and an identity can be an IAM user or an IAM role or an IAM group. Principal. A principal is basically a person or application that chooses the AWS account root user or an IAM user, or uses the IAM role to sign in and then make requests to AWS. IAM identities, example of IAM identities is IAM user, IAM group, IAM roles. These are just entities that has specific identification within your account, and they have certain permissions to perform certain actions. Now let's talk about how IAM works. When you create your AWS account, you can log in into your AWS account using your root user credentials. Once logged in, you can create a new principal, either an IAM user or an IAM role. Also, you can configure federated users to be able to log into your AWS account. An application can act as a principal by using the credentials of either an IAM user or an IAM role. A principal then sends an authentication request to be able to authenticate into your AWS account. So principals authenticate with your AWS account, and after authentication is done, the principal then tries to perform certain actions like maybe create an EC2 instance or create an S3 bucket. Now those requests go through the authorization process, and the authorization process is basically checking every available policies to be able to see that the principal is actually permitted to perform the actions that they are requesting for. So when the request is checked and the policies are all checked to see if the principal has the permission, the authorization is granted and the actions are then performed. You see here EC2 service, you can either run an instance, start an instance, stop an instance. And for IAM, the action could be you want to create a new user, you want to delete a user, you want to get a user's details. An S3 could be you want to create a bucket or delete a bucket. Now those actions are performed. Depending on the actions, resources are either created or updated or deleted. So this is basically how AWS IAM works. Now let's go to the AWS console to take a look at the IAM dashboard. Assuming you are just getting started with AWS, you have only your root user credentials. Your root user is the email address you provided while you were creating your AWS account. Log in with the root user credentials and then search for IAM. This will bring you to the IAM dashboard. In the IAM dashboard, you will see some security recommendations. In my case, I'm seeing a recommendation that is telling me to enable MFA for my root user. This is because I have not done this before. So I can choose to click on Add MFA. Now, if you've not enabled MFA for your root user, I strongly recommend that you go ahead to do this. I will be skipping this step for now because this account doesn't have any sensitive workload. Back to the IAM dashboard, you'll be able to see your user groups. This talks about the groups that you have. Currently, I don't have any groups in this account. It can also show you how many IAM users you have in your account. I don't have any created currently. This is just a new account I created. So it comes with inbuilt 4 roles that is being used. We'll take a look at those. And some policies. Now policies here is showing as 0 because I have not created any customer managed policies. Identity providers, again, identity providers is what is used to be able to enable federation, where if you have an identity store within your organization, you can then link that identity store with AWS through identity providers in IAM. At the right hand corner here, you will see your AWS account details, your account number, account alias. Currently, I don't have any account alias. What does account alias do? You see the way we have the sign-in URL and it specifies the account number here, then you sign in. You can give this URL to anyone who wants to log into your account. Then they can put in the credentials that you provide them. So instead of account number, you can say you want to use an account alias. I'm just going to quickly create an account alias and I will call it Tobe Tech. You will see immediately that the account number has been replaced with the account alias. Now let's take a look at the various features. User group. I don't have any group at the moment. You see a brief description of what the group does. A user group is a collection of IAM users, and the purpose for a group is to be able to grant permissions collectively to a group of users. So if you create a group, you'll be able to add multiple IAM users into this group. Users, no users in this account. Will make later videos where you see us create IAM users. You can create an IAM user and this user will be able to log into your console just the way I've used the root user to log into the console. Roles. Currently there are 4 roles in this account. You can see it specifies the roles, and what those roles do is specifically it gives temporary credentials so that your AWS APIs can be called using temporary credentials. And temporary credentials are credentials that have a specific limited or restricted lifespan, so they expire after a specified time. Again, policies. Now you can see so many policies here, and these are AWS managed policies. These are policies that are built by AWS. You can use the search feature to search for specific policies. I want to search for admin. So I see there's a policy called administrator access. I'll click on that. Now let's take a look at the policy itself. The policies are written in JSON format. Now this is just an administrator access policy, and you can see the effect of this policy is to allow an access. And what are the actions? Star is specified, and star just means all the actions that can be performed in your AWS account. And on what resource do you want to allow this action? Again, you see star being specified, which means all resources in your AWS account. This is how IAM policies are written in JSON format. Let's now go and take a look at identity providers. Now again, you see it specifies that you use identity provider to manage your user identities outside of AWS. So let's say you have an Azure AD, for example, within your organization. You can create an identity provider in AWS and then link it up with your Azure AD so that the credentials that user have in your Azure AD, they can use that same login credentials to be able to access your AWS console and therefore be able to call APIs and perform actions in your AWS accounts. You can take a look at the account settings. I think a major feature of the account settings is it allows you to set a password policy. Now, a password policy is used to configure certain restrictions on the specifications of password for your IAM user. So if an IAM user is created that we have console access, you can set a specific password policy that will restrict the strength of the password that is created and attached and associated with your IAM user. Currently, I have a minimum length of 8 characters for the password, and you can specify if you want uppercase and lowercase numbers. Alright guys, that's it for this video. Please like, share and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.